I'm Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and today's question comes to us from Jeffrey, who wants to know whether or not I think my stories would have the same impact if they were written today, or if this current generation is simply too jaded and desensitized by decades of exposure to graphic horror imagery in books and movies and games and so forth. Now, I always have a bit of difficulty in these questions of the temporal dislocation of my stories, and that comes down to the fact that my stories are very much products of a specific time, a specific place. I was synthesizing all the other works that I was exposed to, and none of my creations just formed sui generis from my own mind. Obviously, my own peculiar nightmares certainly helped midwife them, but I was working in a context of other artists, other writers. There is so much of Poe and Dunsany and Machen in my stories, and I would hate to lose sight of that context. And so the idea of taking those stories as if the great race of Yith were able to simply scoop it all up and put it in the year 2020, well, it loses that context. These stories wouldn't make sense without them. Otherwise, they would be inspired and take their own new synthesis from the decades of authors that came before 2020. But then we run into a bit of an issue of causality, because, if I might say so humbly, my own writing was not there to inspire the writings of other authors in those intervening decades. Then by the time we get to 2020, we have no idea what the literary landscape looks like. It's like trying to imagine how would Australopithecus do in the modern era if you simply took them all and placed them here. Well, they might do just fine, but you can't truly say, because if Australopithecus is not back in its own era, then it completely changes the landscape. There'll be no Australopithecus to inform this current epoch, and that would be a shame, because of all the homonyms, Australopithecus is the most fun to pronounce. Finally, as to this question of whether or not this particular generation is somehow more jaded or desensitized to horror, is one that I think can be questioned. You see, my own generation was responding to nightmares and horrors of our own, the Great War, the rapacious nature of industrialization, the false promises of modernity, whereas this generation is dealing with its own traumas, its own nightmares, such as, see, there we go, female Ghostbusters and being asked to wear a mask during a pandemic. You see, we all have our traumas, and they inform the art around us and help us to cope with the nightmares within. I hope that answers your question. As always, I'm Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Thank you.